How did he describe the presence of God? Awe, rest, amazed at God's wonder, not being able to get enough. All that God is, touching his heart. Feeling that God is so near that he could reach out and touch him. He doesn't want to leave. Let the world move on. I want to stay right here. That was his experience. How would you describe the presence of God in your own experience? Is it what you feel when you're awed by a beautiful sunset? Is it that marvel that you experience as you hold that newborn baby for the first time in your arms? Is it the comfort that you receive when you've been diagnosed with an illness? Is it the wonder that overwhelms you when you see one of those recreations of a biblical miracle on TV or in a movie, like the parting of the Red Sea or Lazarus walking out of the tomb? Is it the lift you receive in a worship service? Is it the transformation that you see in someone else's life? I'm sure you could come up with more. And those descriptions are very real. Because the Bible tells us that God desires to draw near to us. He desires for us to experience his presence. Since he created us, he has desired to make himself known to us, and he wants us to seek his presence. He welcomes it. He rewards it. We were made to experience God's presence. Now, how do I know that? Because in the Bible, it tells us that we are invited to seek him. 1 Chronicles 16:11. Sound familiar? Look to the Lord and his strength. Seek his face always. When we seek God, he will draw near to us. James 4:8. Come near to God, and he will come near to you. When God came to the earth in the form of a man, what was he called? Matthew 1:23, the virgin will conceive and give birth to a son, and they will call him Emmanuel, which means God with us. He's God with us. He comes to us, and he wants us to come to him. Hebrews 11:6, and without faith it is impossible to please God, because anyone who comes to him must believe that he exists and that he rewards those who earnestly seek him. When we seek God and his presence, he rewards our search. We find him. We find his presence. In many ways, God's people encounter his presence in the Bible. Remember the story of Elijah? When Elijah was running for his life from Queen Jezebel, he prayed, God, take me. I want to die. But an angel came to him and said, no, go on, go on. But I've done God's work, and they're killing all the prophets, and they want to kill me. And the angel said, no, go on. God will draw near to you. And so God drew near to him. God said, I am going to come to you. I'm going to encourage you. I'm going to empower you. God's presence came to Elijah. But how would he come? In what form would that presence be? I want you to turn to some passages. This is our first one. 1 Kings chapter 19, verse 11. We'll be flipping around a little bit, so follow along. 1 Corinthians chapter 19, verse 11. 1 Kings chapter 19, verse 11. What? 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 1 Kings chapter 19, verse 11. That's, you guys are awake. I appreciate that. So, that's right. I do that, just to make sure you're with me. Kings, Corinthians, that's all the same. Turn with me to 1 Kings chapter 19. Verse 11, 1 Kings chapter 19, verse 11. The Lord said, "Go out and stand on the mountain in the presence of the Lord, for the Lord is about to pass by." And then a great and powerful wind tore the mountains apart and shattered the rocks before the Lord, and the Lord was not in the wind, but the wind was there. After the wind there was an earthquake, but the Lord was not in the earthquake. After the earthquake came a fire, but the Lord was not in the fire, and after the fire came a gentle whisper. When Elijah heard it, he pulled his cloak over his face, and he went out and stood at the mouth of the cave. God's presence came to Elijah. Now, how did he come? Did he come in a great and powerful wind? Did he come in the form of a great and powerful earthquake? Did he come in the form of a great roaring fire? No. He came in the form of a gentle whisper. That's how we see God's presence come to Elijah, but he came in other situations and to other people. And I want to look specifically now at Moses. The first time that God's presence came to Moses, it was in the context of him telling Moses, "I want you to lead your people out of slavery in Egypt." You see, Moses had been born in Egypt as a Hebrew, and you know the circumstances and the story and how that went. And he was brought into Pharaoh's household by Pharaoh's daughter, and he grew up, but he realized that he was a Hebrew, and one day he saw a Hebrew being beaten by an Egyptian, and he killed that Egyptian, and he knew what he had done and that his life was in danger, and he fled for his life to the wilderness. And he thought he was okay. But one day God came to him and said, "I've got a job for you to do. I want you to go back to that place. And I want you to go to Pharaoh, and I want you to tell him that you're going to bring the Israelites, those slaves, out of slavery, and you're going to bring them to the promised land." And how was it that God's presence appeared to Moses? Okay, I got this one. Exodus. Okay, I know that's right. Exodus chapter 3. And we'll be staying in Exodus for a little while. Exodus chapter 3, verse 1. Exodus chapter 3. Verse 1. Now Moses was tending the flock of Jethro, his father-in-law, the priest of Midian, and he led the flock to the far side of the desert and came to Horeb, the mountain of God. There the angel of the Lord appeared to him in flames of fire from within a bush. Moses saw that though the bush was on fire, it did not burn up. So Moses thought, "I will go over and see this strange sight, why the bush did not burn up." When the Lord saw that he had gone over to look, God called to him from within the bush, "Moses, Moses!" And Moses said, "Here I am." "Do not come any closer," God said. "Take off your sandals, for the place where you are standing is holy ground." Then he said, "I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, God of Isaac, the God of Jacob." At this Moses hid his face, because he was afraid to look at God. How did God draw near to Moses? In what form? And this time it was a fire. It was a burning bush. And the place where God met with Moses became a holy place. It was holy ground, because that's where God's presence had come to Moses. And Moses did when a burning bush talks to you, you listen, you respond. And he did. And he said, "Well, I'm going back. I'm not crazy about this idea, but I'm not going to argue with a burning bush." And he went back and he said, "Pharaoh, let my people go." And after a series of significant, miraculous events, he let them go. And off they went, heading toward the promised land. And as they traveled across the wilderness, God appeared to them again. Now, how did Moses and the Israelites experience God's presence this time? Exodus chapter 13. Exodus chapter 13, verse 21. Exodus chapter 13, verse 21. By day the Lord went ahead of them in a pillar of cloud to guide them on their way, and by night in a pillar of fire to give them light, so that they could travel by day or night. Neither the pillar of cloud by day nor the pillar of fire by night left its place in front of the people. God's presence came to Moses and his people in forms that would lead them. A pillar of cloud, a cloud that would lead them during the day. Wherever they went after the cloud, because the cloud was God's presence, leading them to where they needed to go next. And he led them at night with a pillar of fire, a flame. They followed the flame because it was God's presence. And then they came to the mountain. And Moses went up the mountain to receive the law of God from God for his people. But when he came back down, what did he find? He found them worshiping an idol, and God's wrath was carried out against those sinners who were worshiping an idol instead of God, and many of them died. And after this, Moses and the people who were remaining were shaken. Is God going to stay with us, or is he going to leave us? And Moses must have thought, am I going to still lead these people, or is there going to be anybody left to lead? And so God came to Moses to reassure him at the tabernacle. And when God's presence would come to the tent, as Moses entered to meet with God, it says that the pillar of cloud would come down and stay at the entrance of that tent while Moses was meeting with God. And there God told Moses how he would be with him. And how does he describe it? Now go over to Exodus chapter 33. Exodus chapter 33, starting at verse 12. Exodus chapter 33, starting at verse 12. Moses said to the Lord, "You've been telling me, lead these people, but you've not let me know whom you will send with me. You have said, I know you by name, and you have found favor with me. If you are pleased with me, teach me your ways, so that I may know you and continue to find favor with you. Remember that this nation is your people." The Lord replied, "My presence will go with you, and I will give you rest." Then Moses said to them, "If your presence does not go with us, do not send us up from here. How will anyone know that you are pleased with me and with your people unless you go with us? What else will distinguish me and your people from all the other people on the face of the earth?" God said to Moses, when you leave this place, my presence will go with you. And Moses said, if your presence doesn't go with us, we're not going anywhere. Why? Because his presence was God with them. And without their presence, the presence of God, God was not there, and they were not to leave. What was God's presence? God's presence was God with them. As they drew near to God, God drew near to them. And the presence of the Lord appeared to Moses in the form that was called God's glory, which is simply the visible manifestation of all that God is. Verse 17. The Lord said to Moses, "I will do the very thing you have asked, because I am pleased with you and I know you by name." Then Moses said, "Now show me your glory." And the Lord said, "I will cause all my goodness to pass in front of you, and I will proclaim my name, the Lord, in your presence. I will have mercy on whom I will have mercy. I will have compassion on whom I will have compassion." But he said, "You cannot see my face, for no one may see me and live." Then the Lord said, "There is a place near me where you may stand on a rock. When my glory passes by, I will put you in a cleft in the rock and cover you with my hand until I have passed by. Then I will remove my hand, and you will see my back, but my face must not be seen." Moses had numerous experiences with the presence of God in different ways, at different times, in different forms, but always it was God with him. As they drew near to God, God drew near to them. The presence of God with his people. In Sunday school, if you were in the class this morning, we watched a video of an account of the coming of the presence of God to an island off the Scottish coast called the Isle of Lewis. The setting of that video was the end of World War II. The people on the island were very discouraged, disillusioned. Extremely high proportion of young men had died in World War II, and so there were very few now on the island. And the remaining young people on the island had become disillusioned with life. And many had even abandoned any pretense of faith in God. And in 1949, there wasn't a single young person in any church on the island. And there were two elderly ladies who became very concerned, very burdened about this, about what was happening to the young people and how the Christian faith would not be passed on to the next generation. And so they began to go to the Lord in prayer and had a vision in prayer of a church filled with young people. But they believed that for this to happen, they needed to do something. They needed to dedicate themselves to God in prayer. So they enlisted some of the church leaders, and 2 nights every week, Tuesday night and Friday night, they began to pray. And they did this for weeks and weeks. And then during one of those meetings, the word of the Lord came to one of them that it wasn't the young people that needed reviving, it was them who needed reviving. And they began praying out to God, prayers of repentance. They described it later as the power of God invading, sweeping over that meeting. They said something was released in heaven over the island. They believed it was the presence of God. The people of that church now couldn't get enough of God, and they met together every single night. One night they were having their meeting, which usually began at 9 p.m., and that particular evening, there wasn't anything unusual about the meeting or what was going on, and so the meeting ended at 10:45. But as they were preparing to leave, suddenly the door of the church burst open, and someone came in crying out, "There's something wonderful happening outside." So they went outside to see what was going on. The church outside was surrounded by a crowd of young people. There had been a dance nearby where the young people had gone that evening with absolutely no thought of God on their minds. But suddenly the presence of God came upon that hall. And it said that they needed relief. And so they all burst out of that hall and they headed for the nearest church, which happened to be the church where these people were praying. And as the door was open to the church, those young people flooded in, and it says, the account says that they began to kneel, and some even lie on the floor, crying out to God. And one was heard saying, "God, is there any mercy for us?" The meeting began again and did not end until 4 o'clock in the morning. And by that time, most of the young people who were there had become believers in Jesus Christ. The impact of God's presence, it is said, was felt over that island for 3 years. The only thing anybody talked about was God. They weren't interested in anything else. Even when there wasn't a church meeting, they went to each other's homes and they studied the Bible and they prayed. Relationships were reconciled, and there was powerful singing of the glory of God that came from those people. The presence of God. God desires to draw near to us. God desires for us to draw near to Him. God seeks it. God rewards it. We've seen how God does it, and it comes as we earnestly seek Him, as we call out to Him in prayer, as we read His Word and speak to Him and interact with Him, as we draw near to Him, He draws near to us. How we need that presence. We need the presence of God in our lives. We need it during the tough times, when we don't have anything else, when there's nothing left for us to draw on. We need the presence of God. We need it in the good times. We need it in every time. And yet, how often do we seek that presence? How often do we seek the presence, the closeness of God? Come and seek God's presence.